So now it's setting up.
All right, I see us. We're live.
We are. We're on. Imagine that. Hello, everyone. Welcome. We're actually a minute early. Oh my God. Excuse me. I'm Randy Dixon, Artistic Director of Unexpected Productions, and doing various interviews and whatnot with improv people from around the world, including right here in Seattle, including right here in our company. And today, I'm lucky to be graced with Tony Beeman, who's going to be, we're going to be talking about improv for a bit. But before I do that, please, again, check out unexpectedproductions.org. We're going to be having classes coming up. We have shows and other interviews that you can see there. And starting next week, we have a Christmas Carol, improvised Christmas Carol starting. And on December 19th, we're going to be doing a fundraiser. So hopefully you can invite all your friends and enemies, whoever, to come and check that out. And hope you do. And I'm sure there's anything else I need to mention right now. I'm sure it'll occur to me. I'll talk a little bit more at the end about these places. But Tony, welcome.
Oh, thank you for the introduction.
Yeah. So you are an artistic associate here at Unexpected Productions, and you've directed a number of shows. You've been in a number of shows. How long have you been in the company?
I think, I guess 12 years I've officially been in the company. I was thinking of it as 15 years when I first started, like, really getting involved in UP.
Right.
Like, I think my first...
Had you done improv before?
I did really bad improv in college. So that I kind of count it, but not really. In fact, I'd walked away from improvisation thinking it was sort of a parlor room trick after that experience, and didn't expect to sort of get artistic fulfillment from it in the future. And I didn't really come back to it. That was like 96, 97. I didn't really come back to it until about 2002.
Yeah. So was it something you thought about, or how did you rediscover, I guess, improv, or realize that it wasn't just a parlor trick?
I always put it like that. I was a poetry major in college, and I loved writing poetry, and I'm like, I'm going to go be a poet. And I had all these writer friends that I would, hang out with all the time, like between classes. We would write and workshop and work together. And then I came out to Seattle, work for Microsoft, because my parents wisely told me they'd only help pay for a poetry major if I also got a degree that would make money. So I came out, my plan was like to go work for Microsoft for like 3 or 4 years, build up a little bit of savings, and then go be a poet, like I was going to Warren Wilson or something. And then when I got out to Seattle and was like on my own in my apartment writing, I realized how lonely that was and how little satisfaction I got out of it. And think it took me a while to realize. At first I just thought, oh, I'm a terrible poet, I lack discipline. So I stayed at Microsoft longer than in fact I'm still there 22 years later, so that'll tell you how that plan went. But I had a coworker of mine, Erin Dean, start taking improv classes and at UP, and she told me I should come along. I was like, I did it. But when I described what we did, she very much described it as something very different. So I took an improv class, and I was fantastically fortunate to have Jill Ferris as my 100 teacher. And through that, I discovered 2 things. One, that, Jill's approach to improvisation is very much not a parlor trick. In fact, if she ever yelled at us for anything in 100, she's very supportive of 100. It was anytime we treated it that way. And 2, I had this reawakening, and I realized what I loved about poetry in college was that it was really collaborative. Like, even if we were making our own poems, as I was sitting there in a room of other artists writing poems, I'm like, I was kind of treating them as my audience. I kind of knew this group of people as my audience. I know how they feel a little bit, I know sort of the range of people they are. And when I rediscovered improvisation, I'm like, oh, here's a collaborative artist where I work with others. And as I got into performance, I'm like, and I have a sense of my audience any given night. And I sort of can, I don't want to say tailor what I do for them, but I can, I know what they feel. I know what they're engaged with. And like, I can sort of play with them in a sense, like we speak the same language more easily.
Right.
So I was hooked right away. I've done way too many hours on stage, probably. So since then, I've been at UP pretty much every weekend while we were open since probably about 2006, especially since 2008 when I joined the company.
Right. So latching on to something you just mentioned, I'm just curious about the intersection or crossover between poetry and improv.
I think there are some obvious ones, just like language. But I think the less obvious and maybe more important ones are, and hi, Gosha. Gosha just asked, how do you play poetic improv? I think a huge one is William Carlos Williams has this, he calls it no ideas except in things, I think is how he puts it. But really, and we say show, don't tell in both fiction and on stage, but I really embrace that in that, like, I can only show the audience. I'm not communicating to the audience. I think another poet, Seattle poet, Richard Hugo, said, like, if you want to communicate with the audience, get a typewriter. But so it's not about communication. It's about, it's not even about presentation. I'd say it's a combination of conversation and, but I'm putting forward, I'm trying things out. I'm putting forward in poetry images, and in theater, I'm putting forward maybe gesture or expression. But they aren't an attempt to like communicate something exact. They're saying, hey, you and I, audience, have some shared like imagery. We have some shared ideas. We have shared feelings. Let's just like see if we can communicate at this other level that's not about direct communication, not about clarity of like idea. It's about clarity of experience, maybe.
Right. And there's also the connection between poetry and theater in terms of metaphor.
Yes.
Do you wish, I mean, improvisers talk a lot. Do you wish there was a little more attention paid to the language, to word choices, to how we're expressing ourselves on stage?
Yeah. But I would caution that with like, I don't want it to be conscious attention, because so often I want more metaphor, but I don't want someone else on stage to, you know, if I pick up an urn and talk about my mother and we know my mother died, I don't want the other improviser to say like, well, that urn must remind you of your mother dying, right? Like, which happens a lot in improv. Sure. But I want us to have that awareness that like, okay, this urn is my mother in this scene. And to like play with that. Like, now that we both know it, let's play with it, but let's not call it out to the audience. And the same with language. I just want people to fall in love with language. Like, when we play in a style, I just want people to kind of, because the way I wrote poetry is like, oh, I love, in this moment, I love the sound of this letter, right? So like, if I think of, what's his face? Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon the table. Eliot. He, like, the way those sounds go together, right? There's something about, as I speak these lines, I'm in love with these, the sounds of these words. And so I want people, when they play characters, to just, I'm going to be a little bit in love with like how this character feels, how they talk. And when I'm in love with it, I'm going to keep doing it. I'm not going to be conscious of it. I'm just going to hold on to it.
Right. Cool. And do you, is poetry still something that you're going back to? Like, are you reading a lot of poetry, today? or is that something that's kind of gone on the back burner a little bit?
I'd say I will sit down with a book of poetry probably once a week and just read through it. I Another reason I gave up poetry was when I stopped enjoying poetry, and I'm like, I don't want to be an artist in a craft that I'm not an audience of, or that I'm not appreciating. But I also gave it, that was my 20s. And, you know, what does a 20-year-old white man have to like say versus what does he have to learn? There's a lot for me to learn. And I think what I've come to appreciate is, for me, in this particular point in the like in history, it's better for me to be an audience of poetry than a creator of it.
Right.
So
Cool.
I do read a lot, and I try to read a lot out of my comfort zone these days.
Right. Cool. So I'm going to paraphrase what Denny's asking, which is, word choices in a scene where you're being spontaneous versus actually having sort of conscious thought in terms of like, how do these words go together? Do you think it's possible to do that in a spontaneous setting, to be able to, be thinking about word choices as a poet, for lack of a better term, while you're being in the moment in a scene with your partner?
It's possible, yes, but I think it takes practice. And so, I mean, if I'm playing in a style I don't know very well, I think it's much more challenging, right? That may put me in my head for a while. I think over time, I mean, we speak all the time with our close friends without considering the words we use. And it's not that we always use the same words. Like, people code switch all the time. Like when you go home and talk to your friends, when you're in a professional setting. So, so I think language could be much like a mask where you just kind of learn how it feels, and then you're hopefully not thinking about it. So if you're playing in the style of like Jane Austen, right, you just have a certain awareness of the formality and what's allowed and what's not, that I hope becomes more emotional than like cognitive. At least that's what I hope when I'm trying to learn how to do a style.
Right. And Denny further expressed about, when writing, every word gets a chance to be re-examined, and something that can happen in the moment. So, I mean, I think we live in a world of improv where it's sort of first draft theater. It's like, that's our only draft theater, I guess, is maybe a different way of putting it.
Yeah, and I mean, to be fair, one of the reasons I was a bad poet was I hated revision. So maybe that's another reason I was attracted to improvisation. In writing, you're like going back, you're finessing everything, you're throwing out like the parts that don't work. Improvisation, we're embracing those and like seeing where we go with it.
Right.
But the gift you have is your fellow performers, right? So like, you're not just editing yourself, you're constantly sort of not in control of this thing you're just playing with.
Right. Right. So are there particular, and I guess don't overthink this, are there particular forms, whether long form, short form games, that you not rely on, but where you've experienced that, where you felt like this is what improv should be like, where you felt that energy, that charge, and you felt like you were also, providing that for an audience, metaphor, poetry, the stuff we've been talking about?
Yeah, I love, as I think do you, film noir a lot, and it's partly just because it's natural to me. But the film noir character, especially the narrator, can go pretty crazy places with metaphor and ways of speaking. The audience just buys because they get that that's kind of the style. Um, so you can describe things in weird ways, things like that. And because I'm very comfortable in that, I often think I I don't do well in that format because I'm especially knowledgeable about film noir. I mean, I need that, but I do it because I'm just relaxed when I perform it, because I kind of know I can, this can go wherever it needs, and I know how to like get back to where we need to be. Like, I can leave the rails because I always know how to get back on the rails.
Right.
So it becomes a very playful style for me.
Right. Well, and it's similar to any improv format or short form game where, I think people love styles in improv because there are the boundaries, there's the borders that you're pushing against, which is the same thing in the rules of a game or the way a game is played. And I think that contributes as well to a fondness for styles. At least my experience. I mean, I know I like it, but
Yeah.
I like having that. Okay, here's a border. Can do that, can't do that. So
Yeah. I mean, I also think of styles as rather, I think rules can seem limiting, but you can also treat them as a platform in which, or a mask in which suddenly what's important and what's not is very different than what would be important to you personally, perhaps. And you can become that. And suddenly, I always tell my students in my styles classes, it's like a heads up display where you're like, all right, I know what Tony thinks is interesting in this scene, but what does like Ray Bradbury or Raymond Chandler thinks interesting in this scene? And it's like you get little like highlights, like, oh, corruption. That's super interesting to Chandler.
right, cool. All right. So jumping into a topic that we've talked about, talking about, the notion of craft versus art in improvisation. So for me, I personally, I don't see how they're mutually exclusive in the sense that you are expressing art by practicing a craft. So I'm just wondering, do you draw a distinction, or am I misunderstanding what you were talking about?
I think they can be in opposition. I think they have to work together. And I have a lot of ways I think about this, but when they're not working together, I think of like when craft takes over, right? I think the essence of craft is like if you do X, Y, and Z, you will get, this, right? You do these steps to get this required result. So like uh, a craftsman, right? Like if I have an Etsy shop and I'm producing 100 earrings, right? And I'm not saying there's no art in it, but I'm imagining I have like a set of steps I always follow to create this thing. Versus, and I think people have a lot of different ways of looking at art, but I would say at some level, you're not in control of something, right? So like a craftsman in a trade is probably looking to to reduce the amount of uncertainty in the process, whereas an artist is at some level hopefully trying to make sure there's enough room for uncertainty. And I think the challenge for a lot of us is how do you marry those two things together? So um, I actually looked up before this two quotes that I think are in opposition a little bit about that. And one was Chandler talking about craft taking over, I think. Raymond Chandler, he says, everything a writer learns about the art or craft of fiction takes just a little away from his need or desire to write at all. In the end, he knows all the tricks and has nothing to say. And in improv, I think that's the show where like the games are all planned out ahead of time and everyone knows the proper way to play the game. And the content is always the same. And so you already know what the show's like before you do it. It might like be safe, but it's probably not interesting after a while. But on the other hand, a Johann Brahms quote I found is without craftsmanship, like inspiration is a mere reed shaken in the wind. And like conversely, without craft, right, the new improviser may have lots of ideas and no idea how to like bring those to the stage. So to me, you can clearly have too much of one or the other.
Right. So for you, in terms of as a teacher and director, where's that balance between those two? Where do you find that like the perfect
It's
weight?
changed, and as my artistic director, I can think of many times early on when I really wanted a lot of control as a director over the like kind of exact outcome of this show.
Right.
So just because I wanted to be safe. And so I would maybe provide a lot of structure or get a lot of notes while directing, which were kind of a good versus bad notes, kind of with a judgment to them, to try to like control that process. Or I would be very concerned about who I cast. And I still am, um, but I'd be trying to achieve this like exact result. Um, and after a while, I realized, as disappointing as it is to not get what you want, it's really disappointing to get exactly what you want, nothing more. Um, and so often I would like have an idea for a show, bring in a cast, and then try to make the cast do my show versus being like, no, the show is the cast. By the time it opens, I'm not really even involved. So my idea has to like change to meet that cast. So over time, I've kind of embraced that second idea of like the idea I had to start the show, maybe like that, like as a writer, it's that first line verse of poetry that you throw out and doesn't even end up in the final poem. Um, and I've tried to make my notes both as a teacher director very observational now instead of judgmental. So what I saw was you did X and Y and that led to Z. Whether or not that's good or bad, like we can talk, like that's sort of an opinion. But let's just know that because we did X and Y, it led to Z. So maybe we want that, maybe we don't. And you know, there's obviously things that we would probably agree we don't want. But as a director, I think that frees my cast up to do the show that's what they were meant to do. And as a teacher, I think it does a better job teaching my students to not put that judgment on themselves in a way that I don't think is helpful.
Right.
I hope.
So have you gotten more comfortable with the uncertainty of it? You know, because, you know, you've heard me talk about directing and stuff a lot of times where it's like, I love being in that position where I, you know, or in my head, I'm going, this might not work. And that's a great place to be. And I've grown comfortable with that rather than like, if I know it's going to work, I'm in trouble. If I know it's not going to work for sure, I'm in trouble. But sort of like, you know, roll the die and trusting obviously the cast for whatever the show is. So is that something that you acquired over time?
I don't think I've arrived. Maybe I can put it best as a thing I noticed as a player first, and now I notice as a director, which is like improv is so much the thing about like I am so 100% in love with what's going on in this moment, but the minute it changes, I like let it go and I fall in love with the new thing. Um, and if I stick to the first too much, I'm just only in love with the thing I'm doing. I become married to my idea. As a director, that means I hold on to my original idea for the show. As a player, it just means I don't accept your new offers. But you can also go too far the other way of like, I'm just I never fall in love with anything because I'm always moving on to the next thing. And I think I've also gone too far in the other direction where I don't I let go of too much of the sort of unifying thread of a show. And I've directed a couple of shows where I felt like I did my cast a disservice by leaving them on different pages. And I would see them frustrated at the end of the show because like neither aesthetic won. And I was like, oh, I needed to either marry these aesthetics together or like give them the vision that this one should, be dominant.
Right. Huh. Well, and going back to the kind of along those lines, going back to the notion of craft versus art, because one thing that puzzles me is I don't know how you can do art without the craft. I mean, maybe it's accidental, maybe it just happens, and you get lucky in a show. I've certainly seen that in improv. But I'm just wondering, can they live in isolation or must they be together in a relationship? art and craft?
I think the most successful lack of craft I've ever seen in a show is probably where you'll have a new improviser and a very inexperienced improviser. And perhaps the new improviser is completely unlimited by what they don't realize they don't know. And the experienced improviser is, if for whatever reason, has found it in themselves to be thrilled by the new improvisers, like by that feeling. I find it, I see it a lot in what is probably a bad example, where an older improviser has a crush on a newer improviser. But something about that often does mean like the older improvisers, like kind of in love with what the new improviser is doing. They'll do some of the fix up and provide some of that craft, while giving some freedom to what the new improviser is bringing. So I guess there's an example, which again is not an ideal example.
Right. Because there you have a blend of the experienced improviser who ideally has craft, using their craft to help shape the art that's coming out of the inexperienced improviser.
Yeah. The other example I guess I think of is what happens when the experienced improviser lets go of the rules of the craft for a moment, or even just abandons, like, okay, we were kind of on a path, but the audience was different tonight, or the moment's different, or I trust myself that I can get back on the rails. Rails is a bad word, that I can bring kind of my craft knowledge, but for a moment I'm going to abandon that and just like see where this goes. And that's often where I'll see a more experienced improviser light up and bring a little bit back of that energy they had as a new improviser.
Right.
Because they don't know what to do, and that's very thrilling, I think, for a lot of us who've improvised for a long time, to a limit.
Right. And what do you make of so to me, art can happen on its own or with some experience, and then craft is something that you develop over time. In my experience, I don't know if you feel the same way. In my experience, I see a lot of people who've not necessarily mastered the craft of improv, and then kind of jumping into the deep end of the pool. And and in a way, it takes away from the possibility of art being created in the form. I don't know how you feel about that.
It certainly happens. I know a lot of improvisers that I thought were very strong improvisers who gave up once they had to perform with new improvisers a lot, because their take was like, I want to explore these ideas, and they're not, my offers are never taken by these new improvisers who lack the craft to even know I'm making these offers or know what to do with them, right? Like they're walking in with an electric guitar into every scene, and my acoustic guitar gets drowned out. Maybe a useful distinction is skill versus craft, because I do see a lot of new improvisers with like a specific skill they're very good at, but they lack the broader craft. So they're actually like relying on this one skill, be it like accents or a funny character, or like singing, or like crying, whatever that little like trick is that becomes a single skill that you could call craft, but really it's a skill without the broader craft of improvisation.
Right. So how do you encourage in students or other improvisers to pursue the development of skills and developing the craft versus just relying on the two things I'm really good at, or which I see a lot, so it's like, oh, I just do these two things and that's what I do, versus, well, you should strive to do more. You should get better at these things you're not good at, and add tools to the belt. How do you encourage that?
Maybe it's easy to see where I see it go wrong, and one was a thing that kind of led to me asking this question, which was performers that only treat it as a craft and not an art often have this idea that they're going to arrive someday and they've made it, right? They'll have mastered the craft and they've made it. And so if you have that mindset, I think it's a very pessimistic mindset, because it means until you reach that day, you haven't made it. So you're always gonna be kind of insecure and probably trying to front that you have it. And then when you make it, what then, right? Like, what's going to happen? Whereas, like, I don't know any painters who are like, yep, I've made it. Like, I'm a painter, I've done all I can do. um so so to go back to what I like to see with new improvisers, it's like from the beginning celebrating that, like, no one's arrived. So in any given scene, you may have your most amazing moment, and the veteran improviser may like fall on their ass and like completely embarrass themselves. Um, and that should be celebrated in our craft. Um, uh, I also think so much of that's just celebrating the failure too, right? When you do fall on your ass, and that's where observation versus judgment. It's like, okay, like I did a duo once as a student with Brandon Felker. We did like, it's supposed to be like a spaghetti western, and like it was maybe the worst scene I've ever done, and like the audience was cringing. And Sarah Montjoy Petka, who's a fantastic improviser now, she was a student at the time. She was cringing in the audience, and she came up and she was so upset for me, like for like how that scene had gone. And uh, but even then, I was lucky enough to have been sort of led by these teachers that, like, no, like, it was a great gift. Like, one, anytime I'm in a bad scene, I'm like, well, at least it's not as bad as that scene. Um, but it's also like, I know today, I know like everything that went wrong in that scene. And I, not in a like, oh, I wish we could go back and fix it, but I know like 20 different things I could do to like dig myself out of that hole. Um, and like the world didn't end, right? Like, in fact, people remember that scene more than they remember many of my good scenes. um, so so it's like really embracing that, because I think we talk about embracing failure, but we treat it as like it's going to be this magical thing that leads to a great scene, instead of sometimes it's just going to feel awful and you're going to like go home bad mouthing yourself, and that failure you also have to embrace.
Right. Right. Do you find that road to embracing new skills, or picking yourself up if something doesn't work, where does that come from? Do you feel like it's the motivation of the performer, so it's in the performer's personality, or do you think there's something we can embody to a student, to an actor, to go, nope, pick yourself up and here's how you do it?
I don't, I'm sure there's a natural component. I think a lot's life experience, a lot's privilege, right? I think one of the 15 million reasons for us to like embrace diversity and equity is like recognizing, like, you know what, like, I'm pretty safe on stage, right? There's very little that can go wrong. Versus like, hey, uh, if I'm in a class and a female student feels unsafe around like a male student, because of sort of like there's sexual harassment or just a power imbalance here. And I don't mean to imply like gender should be the only, there's a million different reasons that someone may have led kind of a privileged life that makes them feel safer. So from the beginning, I kind of try to figure out, how do I take what I've been lucky enough to have, which is a sense I'm going to be okay, um, or privileged enough to have, and like extend that to my whole class, and specifically paying attention to the most vulnerable people in that class. How do I make sure they have it? Because I think they will become the teachers of the more privileged, people. Um, there's a few other things. I think as a teacher, you always have to identify who doesn't feel safe. Um, but there are people who just naturally like play to not get notes, or uh, and I think the disservice we do in improv is we don't give those people notes. And I think it's also recognizing when like somebody is not succeeding because they're not taking enough risk, and and like recognizing, hey, they're missing out, right? Again, not judging it, but just saying like, what if you tried this, right? So I think there's a
What,
lot of answers.
right. No, looking at your experience level now and looking back on young poet Tony Beeman starting improv, what advice would you give? What piece, like what's the one thing where you're like, I wish I had understood this back when I started, that I understand now?
Man, it's hard because I'm somebody who mostly thinks it's about mileage. It's like all the things I have to say to me, people did say to me, and I just didn't get it because I wasn't ready. I guess with COVID, man, like I've only performed on stage once in the last many months, and that awareness of how many offers there are in a physical space with another performer was amazing. And like I wish I could gift even a year ago Tony with that. And I don't know, anytime you lose something, right, you realize all the things you took for granted about it. So I don't know how I could say that to previous Tony, except in the future, like always recognize, hey, there's so many things about what I'm doing now. I will say this, that I was playing the doctor, and my wife Janine Clark directed a Doctor Who show, and I got to play the doctor. And one of my friends and favorite people to perform with, Elizabeth Bramer, was like the companion in that. And we built a TARDIS, and we would wait inside every night. And like, I don't know if I achieved anything amazing artistically, but I had such an amazing time in those moments. And that was the show I started doing that Kurt Vonnegut advice about stopping and being like, if this isn't nice, like, I don't know what is. Mm-hmm. And I'd be like, just like enjoy that journey. Like being a new improviser has some really great things about it that because you're doing it, you're loving it. I don't think anyone should assume those are going to continue. There will be new things that are great. But so many people think like down the horizon, there's this thing that's going to be great,
right,
and miss out like what's great here that like I need to remember in the future.
So it's sort of like that embracing being in the moment itself.
Yeah.
And really appreciating like, well, here's where we are right now. And
yeah,
tomorrow it'll be different. 5 minutes from now, it'll be different.
Less Buddhist would be Bob Seger's I wish I didn't know now what I didn't know then. Like because new artists think like everything's possible. And I know a lot of experienced improvisers like, nope, you can't do this show because we tried it 20 years ago and it didn't work. So
in terms of craft or skills, in terms of your experience as a teacher and director, what are like 2 things that you wish, like, God, I wish new improvisers would just learn this, or embrace this, or whatever it is?
If I could go back and fix beginning improv classes, I want 2 things. One is like, and again, I always recommend Inner Game of Tennis as like one of the greatest improv books. And Inner Game of Tennis is about the physicality. He says like in Western culture, we think the brain's in charge of the body, but the body is like amazing at like, if you catch a ball, it's like moving all these angles and pivots to like get the hand in the right place. The body knows how to do that, not the like conscious brain. So he says, you've got to turn the brain into an observer, not a dictator, to like be a great athlete. And in theater, I think the physicality is there, but also the emotions are like that. Like, how do I feel about what's happening, and trusting that? Because that whole like the consciousness is in charge of the rest thing, I think debilitates most improvisers from the beginning. And for a long time, it gets worse because we're teaching people new concepts, and people are trying to apply those while they're on stage. And I do want people to like have practice. That's why we have practice and rehearsal, so you can consciously try things. But I would love every time improvisers are performing for them to learn early on to let go of that and trust that skill set is there or not. But they'll observe it either way. Um, and the other thing, I wish we avoided the fantastic, and I love fantasy and sci-fi and all these things, because I see so many improvisers debilitated by the freedom of we can go anywhere, that they get through all of their improv classes without learning how to play just a regular human scene between two characters, which is what the audience is actually there to see, even though they don't know it. I always make my students watch that Simpsons clip where Lisa has like broken Ralph's heart and Bart plays it in slow motion later. He's like, look, if we like play it in slow motion, you can see the exact moment where he gets his heart ripped out of his chest. And it's like, that's what the audience wants, is they want to see these emotional, like emotions impacting other characters, even in the middle of like Star Wars or a Marvel movie or whatever. To pick a franchise where Marvel, where craft has overtaken art.
Yeah, they had 24 chances so far.
Right.
Marvel.
And they're good, but they're not. I think they've lost so much of the art side.
Cool. So I want to switch gears a little bit, although related, because you and I are both in Christmas Carol, and we've been doing Christmas Carol for a number of years. And again, opens next week. You can find out about it at unexpectedproductions.org. We've done it pretty much every year, but not every year since about 1985 or so. Let's talk a little bit about that. You MC the show, and you always say that it's your favorite show of the year. What is it about the story that works for you?
It's a lot. It's actually the show I saw when I was not even a student yet that made me say, like, this is where I'm taking classes, for sure. But it's our only show we do that's on rails very much. Like, we're a very organic improv company. I don't think we like much structure. And Christmas Carol, we tell all the beats of the story. But knowing the rails gives you the freedom to go pretty crazy places. So here's what I love is you can go those amazing places, but you're kind of bound to get back to this arc of like redemption of Ebenezer Scrooge, which means there's a few things that are great gifts as an actor and improviser. Like, you always know, which is rare in improv, you know what your emotional goals are. As Ghost, I'm like, I'm breaking Scrooge down here. Like, I'm like, or like, I'm pointing out how much Scrooge was loved as a kid, like in this scene, right? Everything I do is just, I can do whatever I want. It's gotta like be targeted. I love, because it's a Christmas show, that the audience, it's what Fred says in the play, like the audience really reflects what the message of the story is, which is like they feel like fellow passengers on that same journey to the grave. And I'm curious, there's going to be a loss this year of not having a live audience, but I'm hoping the feeling, like, I know how people feel about that. I'm hoping we can get them there. I think I just love that, of like, there's never a more positive show really to be in. The fact it gets you, Randy Dixon, to do a Christmas show every year. So I love all that. And again, it's like so many improv shows are like great trips to other countries, and Christmas Carol, because it's structured, is like taking a vacation in your hometown, but actually taking the time to like look in all the nooks and crannies of these scenes to like find what's fascinating about this show tonight in this moment.
Right.
Like, I don't know how many times I've like, you've walked into Fred and Peg's, or after Fred and Peg's party and got mad they made fun of you, and every time I'm like, well, what's Randy doing? Like, why is he upset tonight? Or like, how's this ghost, whatever his, Arthur Miller or Mamet, how's this ghost gonna like react to that, get through to him or not get through to him? it's just for me amazing to explore that in like a subtly different way and then turn that way up.
Right. Yeah, it's I mean, the one thing I've learned in doing the show all these years is again appreciating what Dickens did. And it took me years to figure that out, because when again I created the show, I thought, well, everyone's going to change everything, and Scrooge is not going to change, and that's just the way it is, because people know the story in and out. He wants to see A Christmas Carol, so they're going to play with it.
Yeah,
right?
because we let the audience vote on whether Scrooge changes at the end or not.
But again, I'm never floored enough by the fact that the audience always has him change or her change. And it took me a long time to realize, oh, wait a second, of course, because that's the way Dickens has structured it. Like, this is a great storyteller structuring the story so that if he doesn't change or she doesn't change, you've wasted an hour and a half. And it just took me a long time to get that, because I was like, well, yeah, people want to play with it. It's like, no, they don't. They really want a genuine feeling of redemption from that story, and everything in the story leads to that.
And we give the option to not change first. There's always this group that comes back every year that's like bigger and tries to like get them to not change. But the audience who wants them to change reaction always like they react in response to that group, and they're always so opposed to him not changing. So.
Yeah, it's a weird phenomena. I mean, but it makes total sense now when I just look at the structure of the story itself.
Yeah, it's been fun to play with the show over the years too, because we used to get He Doesn't Change a little more, and right. Like a few years ago, we realized, oh, like we have the breakup scene with Belle, but we never see Scrooge and Belle happy. And I felt like that was one of the things where like, okay, they're even less likely to like leave him alone now, because
right. Well, and there's so much, and again, I would encourage everyone to read it, because there's stuff that we don't even use in our version of it, but there's so much more to the story than the trip around the world, seeing Christmas, holidays around the world. Pretty amazing sequence, I think. And so if you haven't read the story, I would highly recommend it. But there's part of me where I'm like, yeah, and we have audiences that come. And as you were mentioning, there's a couple of big groups that come every year. And, again, a few years ago, I realized, oh, this is it's like going to the Nutcracker, or it's their family tradition is to come see our show, which I'm also kind of amazed by, because that was certainly not the plan when we started doing it.
We have kids who are now adults who come back.
Right, exactly. So, but it's such a critical story. I mean, beat by beat, it's just, I don't know. Like right now, I'm in the midst of it because we're doing the show. We're going to start doing it. So I've been reading it and looking at different sources, and I just am always amazed every year by what a concise, crisp, beautiful little narrative that is. Yeah, I mean, it's I don't want to say perfect, but it's a really great story. And I'm sure somebody uses it to teach writing and whatnot by saying, read this story. But how are you going to cope with normally when we do it live in the theater, Tony brings in I don't know, a couple truckloads of costumes.
I literally own a storage unit that's half dedicated to My Christmas Carol costumes.
So what are you going to do this year?
I'm not going to have no costume bits, but the costume's always a mask for me more than, I mean, sometimes it's ridiculous, but it's more of a mask. So I'm going to figure out how to let a smaller amount of things be a mask for this stuff. So.
Cool. And so shifting back into improv land, what uh, what's one thing that you sort of hope uh, to like never lose sight of in improv? Is there one thing where you kind of go, if I lose that, then this is not going to be as fun or worth doing?
Yeah, a few, but the biggest is like there just has to be an unknown. Like I have to go on stage and genuinely not know like that this scene could be amazing. And like something amazing may happen in this scene. Uh, so I have to have that. I have to like be a little in love with the people I'm performing with. Um, and and I have to not be in a judgmental place. Like I know that I shouldn't be in a show the minute I'm sitting backstage, like judging what other performers are doing. That's where I'm like, okay, I'm kind of a problem here. So afterwards, I may have some judgments, um, but even then, I hope they're not. This is bad. I hope they're like, oh, like I didn't get what I wanted. That's okay, but I should note that, right? Like,
Huh. Okay. What's the one habit in improv that you wish you could lose?
I still go into that, like I still have those moments where I'm like, oh, I know where this is going, or I've completed the pattern in my head and I'm no longer in the scene. um I see that a lot, and I just think everyone has to constantly fight against that because our brains want us to do that. It makes life easier, but not theater. um that'd be the biggest. um Yeah, I guess the other would just be bringing too much of our own baggage
Right.
onto stage.
And what do you wish you could do more of, or
Um,
easier? A skill that would be easier for you.
oh, that I, man, I struggle with physicality of like keeping my like consciousness in my body. And there are just some amazing performers out there like Steve Karen, at LA's Improv, who just like do everything with the physical world and like they see it. And like I I wish I had the discipline to like do a lot more of my work in that physical world.
Right. Is there some aspect to theater um, in general, or performance, I guess, in general, that you wish improv would embrace more or incorporate more?
Yeah, I think it's a bigger picture thing. We still have this comedy club model, which is fine, but that shouldn't be the model for improvisation, right? I want more improvisation that isn't improv companies necessarily. And I want us to see it as like, okay, the sort of comedy club show is one improvised thing, but there's 15 or 16 others, including dramatic theater, which I think, because it's improv, will still be a sort of joyful experience. Because I think we don't experience spontaneity without comedy in the Shakespearean sense, maybe. But I don't. I still don't think the art form has gotten to that place of like letting itself be sincere enough um, to often go those places.
Who or sources, I guess it could be books or something else, are your sort of biggest influences? Don't have to be improv books, but just things you kind of constantly return to as an improviser.
I mentioned Inner Game of Tennis. I think that's a huge win. Um, I just I think people need to read more plays because this is maybe a weird way to put it. When in long form, people are always trying to do novels or like full plays, like Shakespearean length plays, but you've got a shorter amount of time normally, and because it's not tightly scripted, you're not going to get to as much. So I also wish people read short stories and realize like a long form improv show probably is about narratively the length of a short story. I think just reading and of course watching performance. I'm thinking of reading now because you can't go watch a performance. But just seeing live theater, every time, whether it's good or bad, I get something out of it that like we could do or try on stage. In fact, bad, as you often say, it's easier to think to notice all the technical elements in a bad show than a good one sometimes.
Right. Right. Huh. And I guess to clarify what you were just saying, are you thinking people like should just pick up a book of plays and read them as a way of expanding themselves, or do you think? And I mean, I know there's benefit to going to theater when we can go to theater.
Yeah.
But do you feel like, oh, I get more out of reading a play than necessarily seeing a play?
I think both. I think reading, also just like reading plays with other people, can be great. I'll do that with my friends sometimes, just as a lark. But I think reading a play, like think of it as an improviser, right? Like pick a play you love, right? Like I love Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. So when we did our Albee show, it made me go through and be like, what would I as an improviser have to do to like end up in a place where I delivered lines like this? And I think you'll find some real surprises, because we all have this extrinsic view of shows where we remember the big moments, but we don't remember any of the mortar and glue that holds it all together. But when you read it as if like, what would I have to do? Like, what would make me say this like line, or go back and forth and say very little, like these 3-word lines back and forth for a while? Like, what would that feel like as an improviser? And there occasionally you'll be like, well, that would just be hard in improv. But most of the time you're going to learn, I actually need to be doing a lot less with every line I deliver, and hold back until I hit these moments, for instance, where I have like, then I let it all out. I think improvisers would find they improvise very different than the way most, because people improvise more like real life, or they know psychology and they say a lot of their ideas. But if you make yourself like think of a play as you're performing it, you'll be like, oh, I say a lot less. And I mean a lot more, maybe.
Right.
But it's simpler. It's almost always simpler too.
Right. Do you find common thread in terms of playwrights that you're reading? And not only just for improv, but I guess in life, but also for improv, because I know you're a big fan of August Wilson. Spent a lot of his life in Seattle. And what is it about somebody like August Wilson that you feel like does what you're explaining, or just explained about sort of the everyday language, everyday life? Because to me, he strikes me as a very poetic playwright.
Yeah.
So kind of bringing both those things together.
Well, here's what's going to happen in August Wilson. If I told improvisers, go do, hopefully they'd be people of color if I'm doing August Wilson, but I said, go do a play that represents the 1960s, then I think they would put on a show where they go a lot of places and a bunch of stuff happens. But an August Wilson play is going to be in probably one location, and people are going to leave and they're going to break an improv rule if there's going to be a lot of action off stage, and they're going to come into this room together to talk about what's just happened. And slowly over time, we're not going to find out more action happens. We're actually going to find out what happened 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. And each character is going to create this rich painting of themselves and their interactions of how they got to where they were at the start of the show. And I think that's so different than the way we approach storytelling in an improvised play, where we treat it as like a whole bunch of things are going to have to happen after the show starts, instead of we're going to like dig up the backstories of these characters to determine how we got there. And that's not, Wilson's great at that. Wilson's great at handling that offstage action, but most playwrights, Albee, Carol Churchill, they're all pretty good at like, not a lot happens, but it's fascinating to watch because it's all directed in this interpersonal conflict, which is actually what's interesting to watch on stage.
Right. And so you sort of wish improvisers would come from that standpoint as well. Like there's a whole history to these characters before the lights even come up.
Yeah, and that's exciting. Like that's what's going to be interesting to explore. And any action is just there to like
Right.
move that exploration forward, most likely.
Right. Well, I sort of felt, like you were talking about, like when we did Four Hearts, which I was in, you directed. Again, that notion of being overly structured as improvisers, which to me was the funniest thing about the whole thing. Everybody wanting to know what the structure was.
Yeah.
But I feel like that moment of like prehistory and having existing histories with characters was sort of critical to that show, that these characters knew each other before the lights came up, and they like people, they don't like people, that there's all this stuff that happens. I felt like you were good at sort of directing us to sort of bring that out in a very sort of actory sort of way. I mean, it felt very much like doing a play. And I know you had some issues in terms of like letting go of the structure yourself. Not
I think when I pitched that show to you, it was like a ghost story about.
It was. Was it called Four Ghosts? I think it was Four Ghosts.
Yeah, it was called Four Ghosts. It's very complicated too.
So was that an easy journey for you to do, to let go and give up and just kind of trust?
It was by then.
People on stage are going to do what they're going to do.
It was partly because I cast all people I trusted as improvisers. And two, I had a really couple of great encounters with great improv teachers. I think Jun Amai in Japan, who really is great at working with that thing I talked about letting the emotions be in control. And Joe McGinley at Improv Theater, I think, is really great at understanding how to get improvisers to drive a story forward with what they want and their emotions, rather than actions and like events that are happening. So I had the fortune of like working with both those improvisers who really had, for about a year, I'd been rolling around some approaches there.
Right.
So I was very fortuitous to have come to it at that point, to get to how do we do a play like improv that really feels like a play. So
right. And do you see that influencing your future work? Or
yeah, I mean, Dave Morris at Paper Street makes fun of me. He's like, of course Tony's here to talk about relationship because that's all he wants. But that is true. If I want my shows to be like 90% relationship, and then some stuff happens to, as Raymond Chandler says, that's the rules of the game. You got to do a crime story to keep people thinking that's why they're being entertained. But I want to like really see the ball that's being played back and forth with in tennis is emotion, right? And relationship.
Right.
So yeah, I hope so.
Cool. And you're teaching 2 weeks of the 600 class.
I'm teaching character and how to use Zoom.
Right. I guess I should take that class.
Me too. Cool. I'm curious what I'm getting.
Well, thank you, Tony. Sarah Hanshar, who's one of our company members, says, please still dress up as Pikachu and wear a baby mask.
Yeah, that disturbed a lot of people, but
so that's from an Improvised Christmas Carol. And speaking of Sarah, I believe it's next week. She will be my guest.
Oh, great.
And we'll be talking about working in theme parks, because she has a lot of experience working at Disney World and Disney stuff, as well as other stuff. So we're going to talk about like the ins and outs of that and the lifestyle of working at theme park, which I've
been to a ride. She used to do the Monsters Incorporated ride, which is an improvised ride. So it's fascinating.
But anyway, again, if you would like to donate, if you'd like to find out about shows, classes, unexpectedproductions.org. I see Kent posted a link to an Improvised Christmas Carol, which again opens next week, and we'll be having Tony and myself in it. So get tickets for that. December 19th is the big fundraiser, which we'd love to have you come to, because we're trying to create this bridge between where we are now and hopefully our reopening. And yeah, so thanks, Tony.
Yeah, thank you. I had a great time.
All
Thank
right.
you, listeners.
Yeah, take care.